gentlemen, it's our custom to welcome to this podium business leaders of our time, and occasionally the movers and the shakers of government too. But it's rare that we have the pleasure of hearing from such a Renaissance man as Felix Rohatyn, someone who has distinguished himself in both business and government, someone who is as comfortable in the capitals of Europe as he is in New York or in Washington, a master of finance, but also a philosopher, someone who applies the disciplines of business to the civic realm and the ethics of civic society to the marketplace and enriches them both in the process. Felix Rohatyn's life has spanned the turmoil and the great issues of the last century. He was born in Vienna while that city was still the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. He received his early schooling in France before coming to the United States as a 14-year-old boy. Little did he realize that 55 years later, he would return to Paris as the ambassador from his adopted country. He attended college in the United States, and when he was barely 20 years old, he joined the great investment banking firm Lazard Frères, itself a financial bridge between France and America. It was there, at Lazard Frères, that Felix became famous as a business and a civic leader. He became partner in 1961 and was managing director when he retired 6 years ago. But he first moved from the business pages to the front pages in 1975, when he became known as the man who saved New York. You remember those days when New York was so deeply in debt, in such a financial crisis, that the city actually appealed to Washington, to President Ford, to help it avoid bankruptcy. And the answer was no, prompting the very famous daily news headline, "Ford to New York, drop dead." But instead of dropping dead, New York turned to Felix Rohatyn. He engineered the negotiations that restored the city to solvency and unprecedented vigor. And he didn't just return to his desk, but he stayed on as chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation for 18 years, making sure that the city stayed fixed. Felix Rohatyn left Lazard Frères in 1997 to become ambassador to France during the Clinton administration. Not an easy job at any time. But perhaps a little easier than it would be right now. At least in that era, the menu in the congressional cafeteria wasn't being rewritten to feature freedom fries. Even in the best of times, it seems that the French and the Americans have a way of getting under each other's skins, and any ambassador has a full-time job just interpreting one to the other. Today, Felix is president of Rohatyn Associates in New York, which provides financial advice to corporations. But he is still best known for his civic life, a statesman who brings a very broad perspective to the major issues of our times: the economy, the state of our cities, the transatlantic alliance, and global civility. Please join me in welcoming Felix Rohatyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. It is a little stunning to stand here in front of this extraordinary room with this extraordinary crowd. And as we were walking in tonight, I said to John Bryan, "My God, what a big crowd you have." He said, "In Chicago, we don't do small crowds." And by God, that is just marvelous, and I'm very touched. I'm also, in addition, touched to be with friends like Lester and like John Bryan. John, in particular, was hugely helpful to me and to my wife when we were in France, helping us both with business issues and cultural issues. And it was, and still is, very much appreciated. I came here to talk about Europe. And we can talk about New York some other time. But I did come to talk about, incidentally, I just want to tell you a little story about why I stayed 18 years as chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation. Bob Strauss, who was then chairman of the Democratic Party, had urged me to help the governor, help the city. And so I said, yes, but I really don't have time to do that. And he said, well, it'll take you a couple of weeks, and you'll meet some interesting people, and you'll have a good time. So I said, okay, 3 weeks. I was supposed to go on jury duty. So about 3 years later, I was battered, black and blue, having dealt with unions, banks, the president. And I finally called Strauss on the telephone, and I found him in a restaurant in Paris. And I said, Strauss, you remember you said 2 weeks? It's been 3 years? And he said, Rohatyn, he said, saving New York City is like making love to a gorilla. He said, you don't stop when you're tired, you stop when he's tired. So now it's Mike Bloomberg's turn with the gorilla. But in any case, back to Europe. I wanted to talk about Europe because I really think we're at a crossroads in our relationship with Europe, and that it's a very important moment for us and for them, and that it's something that I think we ought to think about. When Dean Acheson wrote his book, President at the Creation, Harry Truman's former Secretary of State was referring to the creation of the institutions and the alliances that preserved the peace and promoted prosperity from the end of World War II to the present. Some of these institutions were political, such as the United Nations. Some were financial, such as the World Bank and the IMF. Some were military, such as NATO. And some were economic and industrial, such as Jean Monnet's European Coal and Steel Authority, which over the following decades led to the European Common Market, the European Union, and the Euro. Supported by the United States until recently, these institutions were the response of the Western democracies to 2 world wars and to the threat of the Soviet Union and to communist ideology. The military protection of NATO and the economic support of the Marshall Plan made possible the future of Europeans as free and prosperous people and set the stage for the most successful peacetime alliance in history, the Transatlantic Alliance. Its underlying defense posture was one of collective security, containment, and deterrence, a policy that's been maintained continuously by the U.S. since World War II. When I went to France as U.S. ambassador in September of 1997, it was a time for optimism in Europe. The introduction of the euro was a success, a remarkable achievement under any circumstances. The introduction of a single currency with its own central bank by 11 modern advanced democracies was symbolic of a new Europe. The new currency was seen as a harbinger of further economic reforms along the free market lines of American capitalism, and most importantly was viewed as the next to the last steps to Jean Monnet and George Marshall's dream of a united Europe. The early results of the euro seemed to justify these expectations. European capital markets boomed, cross-border and transatlantic investment flows grew spectacularly, and transatlantic economic integration grew significantly as a result of globalization, liberalization, and investment. At the same time, the political and economic integration of Europe proceeded apace. From the original 6 countries that made up the common market, the European Union grew to 15 countries, and with the current applicants, will grow to 25 members. With a population of ultimately over 450 million people, it will be larger than the US, and its GDP of $8 trillion makes it second only to the US. The numbers show the importance of the transatlantic economic partnership. In 2001, the aggregate value of foreign direct investment by the European Union in the United States stood at $800 billion. American foreign direct investment in Europe stood at $640 billion. These figures are based on historical cost, and their actual market value would be several times these amounts in the trillions of dollars. In addition, European portfolio investment in the United States included several trillion dollars of stocks and bonds, and American financial investors own 30 to 40% of all stocks listed on the French stock exchange. In the same year, U.S. exports to the EU totaled $354 billion, and imports amounted to $415 billion. 4.5 million Americans were directly employed by European companies, and a similar number of Europeans worked for U.S. companies. We are each other's biggest customers, biggest suppliers, biggest investors, and biggest employers. Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, whatever differences occurred between Western Europeans and the United States were overcome by the overarching threat of the Soviet Union. France supported us on most big issues, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the basing of medium-range missiles in Europe, and in 1991, the Gulf War. However, Franco-American relations were usually more difficult than those with other countries, despite the fact that we'd been allies since independence. While many European countries had problems with one or another element of our economic or security policies, France was the country that was most frequently in opposition. France seemed to feel most threatened by so-called American hegemony, consisting of our hard power, namely the military and economic power that could compel, as well as the soft power such as motion pictures and music, language and fashions, television and radio, which appealed to the young and was seen as a threat to French culture. When Socialist Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine spoke of American hegemony, and when conservative President Jacques Chirac speaks of the need for a multipolar world, they're saying the same thing. America's overwhelming presence is a threat to French identity that must be contained. However, the alliance and the relationship with the United States still had the priority in France's foreign policy until this year. The crisis over Iraq shattered much of this edifice. The unity of the Security Council collapsed as France, Germany, and Russia, with China in the wings, lined up against the United States when the time came to act. There are, of course, precedents to the breakdown of international structures, and they always have consequences. World War I and its aftermath, the Treaty of Versailles, had shattered Europe and its institutions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, so did the Ottoman Empire and Russia. Russia then adopted communism. Economic reparations were imposed on Germany and led to hyperinflation. The world went to a depression, and Germany to fascism. The League of Nations was dysfunctional. Hitler and Mussolini were unchecked, and the result was World War II. I don't believe we're headed for World War III, although I believe the world to be less stable than during the Cold War. But the security system, which provided peace and prosperity for the past 50 years, may possibly be damaged beyond repair, and we should urgently think of what comes next. On the issue of Iraq, France and Germany had a very different risk assessment to ours, both as to the need for military action and for its possible consequences. France, of course, having the largest Muslim population in Europe. France and Germany were obviously entitled to express their views vigorously. However, France went much further, and by her threats to veto and her lobbying of other members, she made it impossible for the Security Council to function. In what I believe to be a historic mistake for France as well as for Germany, they had neutralized the Security Council, divided the European Union and NATO, and France had become the leader of a growing anti-American and anti-war protest movement which challenged the legitimacy of our actions in Iraq. During my 4 years in Paris, we had been through a number of sharp differences between France and the United States, but nothing approaching this. It was a shocking development which left and still leaves very deep scars. Having said this, more in sorrow than in anger, there is in these developments blame on both sides, and blame for which several American administrations share responsibility. We allowed Saddam Hussein to survive after the first Gulf War and to continue being a threat. We didn't eliminate the growing risk posed by bin Laden, and a new administration, when it took office, was faced with threats from North Korea and Iran, as well as from Iraq and al-Qaeda. Then came 9/11. Even though a broad coalition was successfully organized to deal with the Taliban and with al-Qaeda, it was clear early on that the new administration was more comfortable fighting wars alone and was not enamored of long-term alliances. The United States rejected, one after the other, many of the international agreements our traditional allies were counting on, such as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Kyoto Global Warming Treaty, the International Court of Justice, and many others. Even though there were reasons for concern with many of these treaties, we showed no real interest in trying to find common ground and made it clear that we considered most international treaties as hindrances rather than assets. And then we announced a new military doctrine, a doctrine of permanent and total military superiority combined with a unilateral right to preemptive war. There are a number of arguments for preemptive war in a world of weapons of mass destruction and of rogue states and terrorist groups. But the lack of consultation and of serious explanation was a shock and a menace to our allies. And the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq has yet to be firmly established. But 50 years of alliance and cooperation, backed by deterrence and containment, had been swept away. Coming on top of the successive rejection of international treaties, our new military doctrine and the harsh rhetoric surrounding it convinced many Europeans that a new America was striding onto the world stage. This new America, with absolute military superiority, would determine for herself the right to go to war wherever and whenever threatened. To many Europeans, this meant that we were bringing war back to their borders, something they had been trying to eliminate for the last 50 years. The European anti-war movement became an anti-American movement, and the Atlantic Alliance is now at risk. In the aftermath of the war in Iraq, where do we go from here? The repercussions of Iraq and the new doctrine that came with it have profound implications not only on America's foreign policy, but also on America's domestic policies, in particular, its economic policies. Financing a strong defense within our historic framework of collective security is very different from financing a permanent sole military dominance of an increasingly complicated, increasingly changing, and increasingly dangerous world. In 1919, following World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, John Maynard Keynes wrote the prescient work, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes was writing about the consequences of the peace on the losers. The Times called for a new Keynes to do so again, but this time to write about the economic consequences of the war on the winners. I believe that from a political as well as military point of view, it is profoundly unwise for America to go it alone. But it is from an economic point of view that America simply cannot go it alone without seriously negative consequences to our way of life and our standard of living. We are struggling with very significant domestic problems. We're excessively dependent on foreign capital and foreign energy. Our domestic long-term liabilities and our unmet social needs are too great to permit the open-ended costs of sole global military domination, preemptive wars, and the nation rebuilding which go with it. We need the alliance to help sustain the costs of peace as well as the costs of war and to sustain economic growth across the Atlantic. I am not a deficit hawk. I believe that from time to time it is not only permissible, but it is necessary to run deficits. Wartime is one of them, recession is another. Over time, such deficits, especially wartime deficits, could be offset by rolling back existing tax cuts in order to keep federal borrowing and our budgets from going completely out of control. Such a policy would, over time, deal with the financial pressures created by increasingly heavy military peacetime budgets resulting from the new doctrine. However, just the opposite is happening. We're cutting taxes further while increasing military spending dramatically. The Iraqi war, the recession in the stock market, together with large tax cuts, have dramatically reversed our budget outlook. 3 years after our budget ran a surplus of $240 billion, this year's deficit could rise to over $400 billion. The President's recent request for $80 billion for Iraq war and reconstruction is likely to be a first installment. More realistic estimates run to $200 billion or more over the next 5 years. Over the long run, the picture is dismal. Instead of the $5 to $6 trillion in surplus that were estimated for the decade ending 2013, the present outlook is for a $1.8 trillion deficit, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Economists outside the government have much higher estimates, as high as $4 trillion. None of this realistically recognizes our domestic needs, in particular unfunded retirement benefits and health care for our aging population. These needs will not be met, but further cuts will actually be required. Will the American taxpayer finance Iraqi reconstruction or another war when we're closing public schools and firehouses? I don't believe that's very likely. These facts must also be seen in the context of our ever-increasing dependence on foreign capital to finance our deficits and the impact of our foreign policy on the future of globalization. Our external deficit of about $500 billion annually, a record level, requires financing of $1.5 billion per day of capital inflows. Our net foreign debt is now $3 trillion and growing, requiring constantly greater foreign investment as a source of capital. This is an unsustainable and precarious situation with the dollar under constant pressure. The spiraling costs of the Iraqi war and reconstruction should make it clear that another such war, now or later, against North Korea, Iran, or even Syria, would be reckless without a different domestic economic policy and strong allied support. Already the disruptions caused by the Iraqi war are having an effect on the global economy. America has been the biggest benefactor of globalization. The breakup of the system of alliances and the weakening of the international institutions that have sustained peace and prosperity for the last 50 years are the biggest threat to globalization. The impairment to trade and investment, as well as capital flows, caused by a fractured Europe and an aggressive unilateral posture by the United States, would severely damage our economy, which is already weak. The dollar is already down 25% versus the euro. So far, it's been an orderly decrease. However, it could become more acute, and in a dangerous investment climate, foreign investment in the United States might come under severe pressure. Foreign domestic investment was down to less than $50 billion in 2002, from over $300 billion in the year 2000, a highly negative trend. Between 1997 and 2001, foreigners bought about $1.3 trillion of U.S. stocks and bonds, and big foreign withdrawals would now severely hurt the markets and the economy. Treasury Secretary John Snow's recent statements amount to a deliberate further devaluation policy of the dollar. I believe this to be dangerous and totally against our national interest. The Federal Reserve might be faced with a Hobson's choice of raising interest rates to protect the dollar and slowing the economy further, or letting the dollar devalue further at the risk of an international financial crisis. Rebuilding the Atlantic Alliance is key if we're to protect the benefits of globalization, which we have championed for 50 years and of which we have been the main beneficiary. The current era of globalization is totally interconnected with the Atlantic Alliance. Both were post-World War II creations when the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank came into being along with the GATT and trade liberalization. The current political fracture of the Western Alliance could well turn into an economic fracture if we're not careful. Congressionally mandated American trade sanctions against European nations that opposed us would be met by European retaliations and sanctions by the WTO. Just as the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and the Depression followed World War I, the breakdown of the Western Alliance could lead to an end to globalization and a serious and prolonged global economic downturn. It is time for us to stop and think about the contradictory nature of our economic policies and our new international defense doctrine. It is clear that we cannot, over time, finance our domestic needs while financing the spiraling costs of unilateral global military domination. Something will have to give, and a crippled Atlantic relationship will significantly aggravate this issue. In a recent article in the Washington Post, Henry Kissinger said, quote, "Too much has happened to prevent a return to business as usual. A revitalization of the Atlantic relationship is imperative if global institutions are to function effectively and if the world is to avoid sliding into a return to 19th century power policies." Kissinger is absolutely right, but it will require a change of perspective of several of the alliance's leaders, including ours, to achieve such a result. It will be extremely difficult to bring about, and it will require a redefinition of the Atlantic Alliance. In 1975, when French President Giscard d'Estaing and German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt organized the first economic summit among the leading European countries and the U.S., a similar conference should be proposed now to deal with the political, military, and economic future of the Atlantic Alliance. We are now at a crossroads. We must decide whether to maintain our policy of supporting and encouraging continued European political and military integration, or, as some suggest, whether to adopt what is euphemistically described as disaggregation, or essentially adopting a policy of divide and rule. Last year, President Bush said in Berlin that when Europe grows in unity, Europe and America grow in security. Many Europeans now believe that this is no longer the case, and that, on the contrary, the U.S. is now actively undermining European unity. If the latter were true, this would mean a historic shift in our policy. Ever since World War II, the United States has promoted the idea of ever closer union in Europe. Upon my arrival to France in 1997, I spoke in support of the creation of the euro on behalf of the Clinton administration. I strongly supported the policy then, and I still support it today. However, as Europe begins to concentrate on issues such as common defense, among others, some European leaders, such as President Chirac and Chancellor Schroeder, seem to be saying that their goal is to build up a counterweight and a challenge to the United States. The new doctrine of the Bush administration certainly increases European fears of American hegemony, and this in turn may cool the administration's enthusiasm for a more united Europe. That would be a mistake for us, as it would be a mistake for some European leaders to construct a rival bloc to the United States. As a result of the economic integration of Western Europe, which is all but complete, the dynamic for greater political and military integration is very powerful in Europe, even if it is to occur in stages, and even if European military spending is still significantly below the levels which must be achieved. Germany and France are still at the core of Europe, new or old, and countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary will always have at least as much at stake in their political and economic relations with Germany and France as in their security relation to the U.S. It is foolish on our part to try to drive a wedge between them. Far preferable is to encourage Germany and France for a constructive way to rejoin the Atlantic Alliance and to participate in the post-war reconstruction of Iraq. It would lighten our burden as well as to improve the chances of success in the post-war Iraq. The transatlantic economy is far and away the most important trade and investment relationship in the world, to Europe as well as to us. Europe, and in particular Germany, are now in serious economic difficulties. The U.S. is facing at best slow growth, and at worst another recession and deflation. Coordinated transatlantic economic policies are necessary to avoid further decline on both sides of the Atlantic and to restore growth. This should start now with European Central Bank reductions in interest rates. All of this requires a healthy alliance. The crisis created by the war in Iraq was not just a single event. It was the result of long simmering differences which came to the surface and which have to be resolved. In order to bring this about, we would certainly have to make adjustments in the way of consultation and cooperation and the sharing of certain responsibilities. But France and Germany will also have to rethink their policies in the light of the realities of post-war Iraq. We are and will remain a European power as well as a global superpower. Our security requirements, our cultural links, and the economic results of globalization make this a reality. In the long run, there will be no new Europe or old Europe. A politically, economically, and militarily integrated Europe, alongside of and as a partner to the U.S., will fulfill the vision of a great American, George Marshall, and a great European, Jean Monnet. The alternative might be a conglomerate of European states where none individually is able to play a major role on the global scene. Such a result would be bad for them and bad for us. It will take time to heal the breach that's been created, and it will be difficult. America has played the role of a European power consistently since World War II, to our great benefit and to that of Europe. At this time, it is the business leadership on both sides of the Atlantic that has the most powerful interest in having this continue. The political leadership on both sides must now step up to the challenge, and British Prime Minister Tony Blair could play a major role in such an initiative by accelerating the UK's accession to the euro. We must encourage Europe to share with us the burden of peace as well as the burdens of war. Otherwise, there may be no peace. Thank you.
Felix, thank you for those comments. As I mentioned to you before, we have a questions committee that prepares questions, and these are on a variety of subjects. But I want to assure you that we in Chicago are not gorillas. So when we're tired, you let us know and we will stop. Okay, so the first question is, you mentioned that France made a historic mistake in making it impossible for the Security Council to function just prior to the Iraq War. Why did this happen, and were there any serious voices of dissent in France at that time?
I think it would have been entirely normal and possible for France to sustain what she believed to be her moral position of being in opposition to this war, and to say to us, look, we think this is a terrible idea, we think it's going to increase rather than decrease frictions in the Middle East, we don't think you should do this, we're not going to join in this, but we're going to abstain. You go ahead and see if you can get your votes, and if you do, we will abstain, and if afterwards you need our help, we'll be happy to talk about it. But the notion of an ally of the United States vetoing a resolution which they had participated in originally, and lobbying African countries and other members of the Security Council to oppose it, that was a line that was drawn that never had even been approached. And it was unnecessary, and it was not even good strategy because it was a fight they couldn't win. And especially since for France, her main position in the world as a power is by her membership of the Security Council and by her and Europe's faith in international institutions and strong and healthy international institutions. What it did is it didn't stop the war, but it weakened the United States, it weakened the United Nations, it weakened the Security Council. And by so doing, it weakened France's position as a world power. And this was why it was, for me, it was hard to understand a position that seemed taken for bravado more than for policy. And I recognize that there was an opportunity for France to believe that together with Germany she could especially, again, play a dominant role in Europe, but that turned out not to be the case. So that's why I think it was a strategic mistake. By and large, I have always admired French foreign policy because they think very long term, they're very logical, they're Cartesians, and they're very unemotional. And here it seemed to me that it was just the opposite. And therefore, from their point of view, as well as ours, I don't think anybody won in this.
Were there any serious voices of dissent within France?
Well, I don't know how I wasn't there at that time, but from what I could perceive, no. The answer was no. There was a highly emotional. There were these anti-war demonstrations all over Europe and in France in particular. And so the political leadership that was opposing us was sort of carried away on this wave of as I say, of anti-war feeling, which became anti-Americanism. But rather soon, serious politicians like Alain Juppé, who was a former French prime minister, and it was very, very close to President Chirac and some other members of the Conservative Party in the Parliament, began speaking out against this, or speaking out sub rosa against this, and now there is a significant amount of, certainly in the business leadership and among a lot of people in France, you find great concern as to the position that France finds herself today, because the Germans are going to come back, the Russians are going to come back, and France will find herself probably kind of alone. I think personally that we should try to give them some way to come back together with the Germans to recreate some other form of this alliance which has served us for the last 50 years. But it's going to be very difficult because the feelings are running very, 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 very high.
Many European nations chose to join the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq. France and Germany did not. How will this split within Europe affect the ongoing efforts to create a larger, more unified European Union?
Well, Europe was having a very difficult time doing this before this split happened. And former President Giscard d'Estaing, who's heading the commission to deal with these issues of European political integration, seemed to be sort of moving towards kind of a two-speed Europe, where the original members of the common market would have one type of responsibility sharing, like in taxes or military, and then there would be probably a larger and more diffuse zone, which would be more of a free trade area. But now this has made it more difficult, although I think on balance the need for an integrated Europe, for a more integrated Europe without going to a federalist system, is going to push them again together. Although their huge weakness is in military spending and in falling further and further behind with respect to capabilities. And in terms of economic reforms, Germany has been very, very slow in making these reforms, which is one of the reasons the German economy is so weak today. And France has done better, actually. France has moved along, although France still has a long way to go. But if you look at French business leadership, and by and large, European leadership. They're very modern. I mean, they run big companies. They run efficient companies. They understand the workings of the marketplace. But they work within a system where the state still has, I don't know, 50% of the GDP, and where the weight of the safety net is gigantic. But it also represents what the people want. And today you have strikes of the public employees in France because they don't want to give up their 55 age retirement, and as a matter of fact want to lower it, which is kind of difficult.
Well, related to that last point, productivity growth in the United States is significantly higher than in many European countries, including France and Germany. So over time, this will lead to a much higher standard of living in the United States. So, because the gap is widening. So what implications does this have for our transatlantic partnership?
Well, I think the biggest problem in Europe is not productivity, because they essentially know how to do it. The biggest problem is demographics. It's birth rate. It's a decreasing population, and a need for more and more immigration, which creates its own political backlash. So if you look down the road 20, 25, 30 years, you see a Europe, a Western Europe in any case, with a very sharply decreasing population. And a very, very sharply changing ratio between retired people and working people. And I think, to me, that is the main economic and social problem that these countries face, because productivity you can deal with by making more investments, by going to business school or whatever. But the other requires different types of actions.
I'm sure Dean Snyder was happy to hear the plug about business schools. What's the role of the British going to be in this transatlantic alliance in future years?
Well, there is, as you know, a kind of tug of war today between Prime Minister Blair and the Chancellor about the euro. And the Chancellor, I think, wants to defer entry to the euro, not even having it be considered for until after the next Parliament, which is, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. And I think Blair politically thinks they should come in as soon as possible, as a political issue more than a monetary issue. I am kind of, I mean, it's none of my business, but I am, if one were to ask me, I would support Blair. I think the UK would bring to Europe a dimension that it doesn't have yet at this point, which I think would to some extent change Europe and would be a real bridge between us and Western Europe. And I think that would be a very powerful incentive to recreate this Atlantic. When I say recreate, I probably am using the wrong words. To create a new and different Atlantic alliance that will deal with the new issues of terrorism, of weapons proliferation, of AIDS, of poverty, all of the things that we have to deal with, and to do it in a way that I think only the West can do if it puts its mind to it. So I would be very strongly in favor of the UK joining the EU joining the euro as soon as possible.
And do you expect that Turkey ultimately will gain admission into the European Union?
I would expect them to, yes. No, I don't look at my record of being right on these things. So I just, as a matter of disclosure, I think I need to tell you that.
Could you tell us how the Europeans view the United States form of capitalism?
Well, yes, they view it as sort of a casino capitalism. And I'm beginning to view it that way myself, as a matter of fact. I spent 4 years, I am a capitalist. I was maybe a little bit of a left-of-center capitalist, but I am a capitalist. But I believe that capitalism can only function, that market capitalism can only function within two bookends, and one of them has to be a very sophisticated and active regulatory system, and the other bookend has to be, a Protestant ethic. And I think within that framework, capitalism is the best system in the world. And if that framework breaks down, then you have corruption, you have excesses, and you have a threat to the democratic system. I spent 4 years making speeches all over France about American capitalism and the market system. And I thought I knew it pretty well. And I would describe the merits of stock ownership for employees, the virtues of the SEC, the sanctity of the Federal Reserve, the fact that we have this ethic all the way through business. And then I came back. And I started tearing up these speeches. Now, I'm overstating this, but I was aghast. I mean, I have no great illusions about a lot of things in my form of business. But I never thought I would come back to find Enron and WorldCom and Tyco and Quest, and then now, what is the name, Health South, and the aptly named Mr. Scrushy, and having every aspect of what is supposedly to protect the investor, which are the boards of directors, the managements, the auditors, the lawyers, the regulators, and the press, all off in this orgy of illegality and corruption, which was way beyond anything that I could imagine. I mean, I'm not surprised that people can tinker with their earnings every quarter to make it look a little better. But to reclassify $10 billion as capital instead of investment, as if this were kind of, 3 people in a computer, that was beyond anything. And to have boards of directors waive their ethics code and auditors certify things that were obviously not right, and having the press treat all these people as if they were movie stars, that's very bad. And I thought actually that there would be some kind of a political revolt in this country, that people would say, no, this is these people can't cost employees and small stockholders and retirees billions of dollars while they go to their ski lodge in Aspen. And yet they do, and nothing happened. I mean, the Oxley-Sarbanes Act happened, which is good, but people don't really seem upset, or it doesn't politically appear to be an issue of abuse of small people for the benefit of insiders, which I always thought was something that you couldn't also tolerate. Huge income differentials and wealth differentials that are illegitimately gained. Now, maybe it will happen, but it certainly isn't happening, and the Europeans see this. And of course, they say, aha, we told you so. And it's very difficult to, well, you can say don't generalize because 3,472 people in the United States did terrible things. But there is something still wrong with our system, because too many things that were supposed to be the platform on which capitalism stands turned out to be full of termites. And I think we have to do more. And I saw the other day that there was a study in business schools where the students were saying, we want to have more courses in ethics. And of course that's right, although I'm not sure you really can teach ethics in business by the time you get to business school. If you don't have ethics, you're probably not going to get it. But an alternative is to make ethics into good business, which I believe is the answer that that companies that are well-run, that are transparent, that have ethical managements, decent compensation structures, will sell at a premium in the marketplace, and that will ultimately create a market-based ethical system. That's for my next book. Thank you. Thank you.
One more? One more? We can't let you get away without asking you about your hometown. Are the conditions in New York now better or worse than they were before when you were called to the rescue, and can they make it?
Well, they're worse. They're worse because factually, the city is in a financially the city itself is in very bad shape financially. When we were involved in '75, we had some assets. We had the state of New York that was in very strong financial position. Today, the state of New York is in terrible financial condition. We had a governor in '75 who wanted to help the city. We have a governor today who can't even help the state, much less help the city. We had an economic environment that was it wasn't great, but it was better. It was beginning to be inflationary, which is something, dare I say, that we might use today. We had union leaders whom we could sit down around a table and make deals with. We had banks. We had New York banks. We don't have New York banks anymore. We have 2 global banks. We used to have 11 New York banks with CEOs who were very involved with the city. And we finally were dealing with a president who, if he didn't say drop dead, meant it, but finally came around. And that isn't going to happen today. I had hoped that because so many cities and states are in trouble in this country, that there would be some type of political support for some type of revenue-sharing program for the next 2 or 3 years to see these cities and states through the worst of their problems, instead of having to raise $100 billion in taxes or cuts that are going to devastate the economy. But I see that there was nothing except for $20 billion that went into this crazy tax bill that is working its way through the Congress. So today, the mayor is faced with a former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, who spent the last 2 years in his office spending hugely in borrowing, a governor who, while he was running for re-election, pretended that his budget was balanced, and a week later found a $10 billion deficit. And this all sort of comes down on the city, where the mayor has now put in 3 different taxes that have increased: property tax, sales tax, and income tax, and is about to try to negotiate concessions with the unions, while I assume that the deficit is increasing every day because the economy is so bad and because inflation is at 0. So that is not a very cheerful picture, and I feel sorry for the mayor. I feel sorry for us. But that is the way it is. And the spirit of the city. Now, you also can't overlook that since September 11th, New York kind of walks and looks back a little bit to see who's following us or who's up there looking at us. And there is a feeling of uncertainty in New York that I never felt before I went to France, and I certainly didn't feel when the city looked as if it might go bankrupt. When actually we felt very up, we were fighting the world, we were fighting the bad Congress from the West or the South or whatever. And today it's not that way. I thank you very, very much for inviting me.
Felix, ladies and gentlemen, Felix, those are wonderful comments. We did not know when we invited Felix Rohatyn here tonight, but he was born the same year that the Economic Club of Chicago was created. So it's entirely fitting that he be here for our 75th anniversary year. Thank you, Felix. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Economic Club of Chicago's 75th annual dinner meeting. This is the final dinner meeting of this 75th anniversary year, but the club's annual fifth night social event on Wednesday, June 4th, promises to be a wonderful evening at the Museum of Science and Industry. Members and their families and guests will have the unique opportunity to privately tour a portion of the Museum of Science and Industry featuring two new permanent exhibits, The Great Train Story and Toy Maker 3000. So if you're interested in attending, please contact the club office as soon as possible. And now, in compliance with the bylaws of the club, Deborah DeHaas, chair of the 2003 nominating committee and managing partner of Deloitte & Touche, will present the committee's report.
Thank you, Michael. I'm pleased on behalf of the nominating committee to present the slate of officers and directors for the 2003-2004 club year, which begins on July 1st, 2003. For chairman, W. James Farrell, chairman and chief executive officer, Illinois Toolworks, Inc., and also recommending him for a 3-year term as director. For first vice chairman programs, Lester Crown, chairman, Material Service Corporation, and he also for a 3-year term as director. For second vice chairman of forums, David D. Hiller, senior vice president, Tribune Publishing, president, Tribune Interactive, Inc., and also for a 3-year term as director. For treasurer, Kathleen G. Murray, president and CEO of Northwestern Memorial Foundation. For secretary, Lyle Logan, senior vice president, personal financial services, the Northern Trust Company, and he also for a 3-year term as director. For the executive committee, each serving a 1-year term, we nominate Philip N. Condit, chairman and CEO of the Boeing Company, Jamie Dimon, chairman and chief executive officer, Bank One Corporation, John A. Edwardson, chairman and chief executive officer, CDW Computer Centers Incorporated, Betsy Holden, co-CEO, Kraft Foods Incorporated, and President and Chief Executive Officer of Kraft Foods North America, and Jonathan P. Ward, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the ServiceMaster Company. And as directors of the club, serving 3-year terms, we nominate William F. Aldinger III, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Household International, Howard B. Bernick, President and Chief Executive Officer, Alberto Culver Company, John A. Canning, Jr., President, Madison Dearborn Partners, Dennis Fitzsimons, President and Chief Executive Officer, The Tribune Company, Brenda J. Gaines, President, Diners Club North America, Harry M. Kramer, Jr., Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Baxter International, Inc., Carl W. Stern, President and Chief Executive Officer, the Boston Consulting Group, Pamela B. Strobel, Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer, Exelon Corporation, Ella D. Strubel, Managing Director, Eloquent Design, Frank J. Teacher, President and Chief Executive Officer, Harris Bank, Miles D. White, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Abbott Laboratories, and Mike Zavrosky, President and Chief Operating Officer of Motorola, Inc. And that's our slate, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Deborah. I'd now like to call for a motion to adopt that slate.
I was going to move that, but I guess we have some others too.
May I have a second? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The slate carries.
Thank you.
Deborah, thank you for chairing this year's nominating committee and for bringing in such a wonderful slate of candidates. And now it's my pleasure to introduce those at the speakers table, and as I call their names, I'll ask each to stand and remain standing until their introductions are completed. So please hold your applause until everyone has been introduced. Beginning at my far left, Erin E. McInerney, Executive Vice President, Harris Bank. Mark L. Gordon, Managing Partner, Gordon & Glickson, and a Director of the club. James Hill Jr., Chairman and CEO, Hill Taylor, and Director of the club. Arthur R. Martin, Vice President, Corporate Real Estate, R.R. Donnelly, and Vice Chair of the Membership Committee. Donna Fred Zarcone, President and Chief Operating Officer, Harley-Davidson Financial Services. Michael E. Lavin, President and CEO, Keystone Advisors, and a Director of the club. Terry Savage, Chicago Sun-Times financial columnist and author. John H. Simpson, Vice Chair, Dresdner, Kleinwert, and Wallerstein. Zamira Z. Jones, President and General Manager, ABC Radio, Chicago. Rodney L. Goldstein, Managing Partner, Frontenac Company, and a Director of the club. William M. Goodyear, Chairman and CEO, Navigant Consulting. Deborah L. DeHaas, Regional Managing Partner, Deloitte & Touche. Donald C. Clark, Chairman Emeritus, Household International, and past President of the club. And now to my far right, D. Stephen Naus, Senior Vice President, Bound of Chicago. Linda P. O'Hare, President, Bridge Organizations, Incorporated. E. Ronald Culp, Principal, Chauncey & Culp Public Relations, and Vice Chair of the Membership Committee. Edward Adam Snyder, Dean, University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. Percy L. Berger, Managing Partner, The Greenleaf Group. Jocelyn Winicky, Associate Managing Editor for National News, Chicago Tribune. Charles K. Bobrinsky, Head of North American Investment Banking Branches, Citigroup. Ronald V. Waters, Chief Financial Officer, William Wrigley Jr. Company. John A. Canning, Jr., President, Madison Dearborn Partners. Adele Smith Simmons, Vice Chair, Chicago Metropolis 2020. Lester Crown, Chairman, Material Services Corporation and Chair of the Program Committee. John H. Bryan, retired Chairman and CEO, Sara Lee Corporation, and past President of the club. And now let's give this group a round of applause. Thank you. And there's one more group to be recognized tonight. As you know, this is our 75th anniversary year, and our staff has done an absolutely sensational job of making this an extraordinary year. And I'd like to read their names and ask them to stand up to be recognized as a group. Elizabeth Doran, Renee Gorey, Meg Massaro, Maureen O'Connor, Stephanie Thompson, and Maureen Murphy. They're right in the back. Let's give them a round. And there's one more person who I want to recognize tonight, and that's the person who, over the years, has really made this club successful and makes it work. And that's, of course, our president, Grace Barry. Grace. Now let's take our 10-minute break.